If you live in an apartment and don't own land, you've probably assumed food production isn't realistic for you. But that assumption has a cost. It makes you completely dependent on a system you don't control, and when that system becomes unstable, even small disruptions can turn into serious problems. This video is not about becoming self-sufficient, and it's not about replacing your food stockpile. It's about what happens when you have no land, no garden, and still want a margin when food systems become less reliable. Most people assume that without space, food production is off the table, but that assumption creates a blind spot. In this video, we'll break down how food production actually works under tight constraints, what mistakes make most small setups fail, and why some approaches work even in apartments or rentals. And if you stay until the end, we'll go into the most practical part, which crops make sense without land, and why choosing the wrong ones wastes time, money, and effort.
This is your safety zone.
A growing number of people today live in apartments, rental homes, or dense urban environments where access to land simply doesn't exist. In that reality, food production is often dismissed as something meant for rural life, backyards or homesteads, not for people living under space and ownership constraints. The default response becomes stockpiling, which makes sense. It's accessible, it's immediate, and it creates a sense of control. But stockpiles are inherently static systems. They are limited by physical space, by expiration cycles, by budget, and by the assumption that resupply will eventually return to normal. Once stockpiled food is consumed, the system offers no regeneration, only depletion. This is where a hidden vulnerability emerges. Growing food without land is not about replacing your stockpile or aiming for full self-sufficiency. That expectation is unrealistic and counterproductive. It is about reducing a critical dependency, even marginally, so that access to food is not a single point of failure in your personal system. Partial production does not eliminate risk, but it changes the shape of it, stretching time, increasing flexibility, and creating options where none existed before.
And once you understand that the goal is not abundance but margin, the next question becomes unavoidable. How do you actually begin building that margin when you don't have land?
Growing food without land begins with treating your home as a constrained production environment rather than a living space you occasionally adapt. That shift matters because every practical decision follows from it. In real terms, this means identifying specific locations where production can exist without fighting your daily routine. Kitchen counters near sinks where watering becomes automatic, windowsills with several hours of stable daylight, shelving units that can support multiple containers without blocking movement, or unused corners that can hold vertical racks. From there, containers become the foundation of everything. Not decorative pots, but functional containers you can replace, lift, clean, and reset without friction. Plastic storage bins, 5-gallon buckets, shallow totes, fabric grow bags, anything durable and inexpensive works, as long as it gives roots enough depth to develop without turning into a heavy, immobile mass. Containers that are too shallow dry out quickly and fail fast, while oversized containers become slow to adjust, easy to neglect, and hard to recover when something goes wrong. Moderate-sized containers that you can move when empty and inspect easily tend to survive longest. Light is the next constraint. Natural light works only when it is consistent. A bright window that fluctuates wildly throughout the day causes more problems than a weaker but stable light source. This is why basic artificial lighting often becomes part of the system, not to maximize growth, but to stabilize it. Indoor growing removes seasons, but it replaces them with the need for controlled light exposure, predictable cycles, and environments that do not change unexpectedly. Vertical setups are not about squeezing maximum output from limited space. They are about distributing risk. Multiple small, independent containers stacked on shelves are far more resilient than one large setup because failure stays localized. The system must also match real life. If watering, checking light, or monitoring growth requires conscious effort every day, it will fail over time. If those actions are integrated into habits you already have, the system survives. This is why production without land is not about ambition or yield, but about building something that tolerates distraction, fatigue, and imperfect consistency. And this is where most people unknowingly sabotage themselves. Even with decent space, containers, and lighting, failure rarely comes from lack of effort. It comes from choosing systems that can't tolerate real life, and crops that simply don't belong in these environments. Once you understand why some setups quietly keep working while others collapse, the choice of what to grow stops being guesswork. And if you want to know which crops actually make sense here and why, stay with me until the end. Most home-growing setups don't fail because the idea is wrong. They fail because time exposes weaknesses that enthusiasm hides. The first days feel productive. Everything is new, attention is high, and small issues are ignored. Then real life resumes. A missed watering, a light left off too long, a container that dries faster than expected, a plant that doesn't respond the way it should. None of these things are catastrophic on their own, but together they create friction. This is the moment when most people quietly disengage. They interpret early problems as proof that growing without land is too complicated, too time-consuming, or simply not worth the effort. The mistake is not failure itself, but the expectation that failure should not happen. Systems that last are designed to absorb mistakes, not avoid them. They assume inconsistency, distraction, imperfect timing, and variable attention. Thinking in cycles instead of harvests is what makes this possible. A cycle has a beginning and an end, and failure inside a cycle is information, not defeat. You reset, adjust one variable, and run the cycle again. People who keep going do not succeed because they are better growers. They succeed because their systems let them recover quickly without emotional or logistical collapse. This is also why time and maintenance matter more than potential yield. A setup that produces less but survives repeated cycles is infinitely more valuable than one that promises more and dies after the first setback. And once you understand that durability over time is the real filter, another question naturally surfaces. If most people fail not because of effort, but because of the choices they make early on, which choices actually reduce friction instead of increasing it? Most failures in small-scale growing don't come from bad luck. They come from predictable mistakes. The first is assuming that planting something is enough, as if growth were automatic once seeds go into a container. The second is choosing crops based on preference or appearance rather than on how well they fit the space, the light, and the maintenance rhythm available. The third is over-engineering. Adding complexity feels productive, more equipment, more steps, more control, but under real-life conditions, complexity becomes friction. The more moving parts a system has, the more opportunities there are for something to be missed, delayed, or ignored. Finally, there is the quiet mistake of underestimating maintenance. Not because people are lazy, but because they assume consistency will come naturally. Under stress, time pressure, or distraction, complex systems collapse quickly, while simple ones degrade slowly and recover. This is why resilient setups are intentionally boring. They prioritize repeatable actions, minimal intervention, and tolerance for imperfect care. Once this is clear, the method stops being abstract, and the focus naturally shifts to the most practical question of all. Given these constraints, which choices actually work in real environments? When you remove land from the equation, the list of viable crops narrows fast, and that's a good thing because it forces clarity. The crops that work best in these environments share a few traits. They tolerate tight root space, grow quickly, recover well from mistakes, and produce usable output without demanding constant attention. Leafy greens like lettuce, spinach, arugula, and similar varieties work because they grow fast, don't require deep containers, and allow repeated harvests without restarting the entire system. Herbs such as basil, parsley, cilantro, and chives make sense because a small amount goes a long way. They fit easily into kitchen spaces, and they integrate naturally into daily use. Microgreens are effective not because they are efficient calories, but because they compress growth time dramatically, turning light, water, and space into edible output in days rather than weeks, which matters under uncertainty. Certain compact root crops like radishes work when container depth is adequate, offering fast cycles and clear feedback, while others fail quietly by locking space for too long. Green onions are useful because they regenerate, tolerate imperfect care, and stretch value over time. What all of these have in common is not yield, but predictability. They do not turn an apartment into a farm, and they do not replace stored food. They reduce pressure. They slow consumption of stockpiles. They create small but repeatable inputs into your food system. What you should not expect are staple calories, total independence, or dramatic abundance. Crops that demand long timelines, large root systems, precise conditions, or constant intervention tend to fail in these setups, not because they are bad plants, but because they are mismatched to the environment.
The real value of these choices is not how much they produce, but how reliably they produce something at all. They don't solve the food problem, but they meaningfully shrink a vulnerability that most people leave completely exposed. Food stockpiles remain essential. They are the foundation of any serious preparedness plan, but they are also static systems. Once you start consuming them, they only move in one direction. Growing food without land does not replace stored food, and it is not meant to. It changes how and when you use it. Even small, modest production reduces the rate at which stockpiles are depleted, stretches timelines, and creates flexibility during periods of disruption or uncertainty. Fresh output, even in limited quantities, allows stored food to be reserved for higher calorie needs, longer gaps, or more severe conditions. It also gives you options. Instead of relying on a single solution, you operate across layers: stored food for stability, small-scale production for continuity, and time as a buffer. This layered approach is what turns preparedness from a fixed reserve into a living system. Growing without land is not an alternative to stockpiling. It is an additional level that makes the entire system more resilient. Not everyone can grow a lot of food, and that's not the point. Almost everyone, however, can grow something. Resilience is not an all-or-nothing condition. It is incremental. It's built by adding small margins, reducing single points of failure, and giving yourself more time when systems become less reliable. Growing without land does not eliminate risk, but it reshapes it. It turns total dependence into partial dependence and rigidity into flexibility. The question worth thinking about is not whether food systems will fail completely, but how your personal system behaves when reliability decreases instead of disappearing. If access to food became less predictable but not entirely absent, which part of your setup would feel the pressure first? And if you want to keep thinking through these changes in a practical, realistic way, subscribe to the channel.